Paybacks, Genesis chapter 42 tonight. So to back up a chapter in Genesis 41, Pharaoh's dream and Joseph's interpretation of that dream has set the course for Egypt. We know in the narrative of Scripture there are 7 years of great plenty coming when we leave chapter 41, and we know that there are 7 years of great famine that are going to follow up after that. But when we get to Genesis chapter 42, what we find is that we've fast forwarded through the 7 years of plenty. And now in Genesis 42, we're going to go straight to those 7 years of famine that hits the land of Egypt. That, of course, is a reference to the tribulation period that is coming. You can read that for yourself and study that for yourself. Revelation chapter 6 through 19. And you know, when I look around at the panic, the freaking out that I see, over some word of some sickness in our country, it makes me wonder what is going to happen to this world that's so obstinate against Christ, so set in their ways against the Lord. How are they going to handle it when Revelation chapter 6 begins and the tribulation period is underway? How are they going to handle it? Are they going to be strong? I don't really think so. They're out there buying up toilet paper tonight. That's why they're not here. So in Genesis 42, that's where we are. We're taking a look at Joseph. We've been following his life. There's been ups and downs. He's on a major up right now. He's the prime minister there, the ruler, the governor. Genesis 42 is going to call him the governor over all of Egypt. And now we see his story as we fade back to the homeland, the promised land, Canaan, one day to be known as Israel. And we're going to see what the family is up to there during these 7 years of famine. So let's begin reading at verse 1. We have a lot of verses to read through tonight, so we'll try to move quick. You try to follow me as best you can. I'll try to lose you. We'll see who wins. Verse 1. When Jacob, that is the father of Joseph, when Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, so that would be wheat. We talked about that. These are grains of wheat. There's plenty of wheat. That's a food staple for all cultures and all societies. That's one of the most complete meals you can have, bread from wheat. Now, not quite the same thing we get in our stores, where it's kind of mixed with all this other stuff, Stroman bread and Wonder bread and all the white bread that you get that doesn't taste like it used to anymore. It just tastes chemically and, different. You may not be able to live on that kind of bread, but real bread, whole bread that comes from wheat, if you just have that and water, you can live in I don't want to say indefinite period of time. I almost said infinite. No, that won't keep you alive forever. So it's a food staple, very important food staple. And they hear that there's grain in Egypt. And Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another? We've got stuff to do. We got to get busy. What are you guys standing around staring at each other for? It's time to act. Things are bad. The famine is underway. We've got to do something." Verse 2, and he said, "Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." And if you read ahead, you know that this is not going to work. Joseph is not going to let them get away with buying bread. That's very important because we're using Joseph as a type of Christ and we're following his story. And we're learning things about Christ as we learn about Joseph. We're learning the New Testament equivalent of what we're reading in the stories in Genesis. And when we come to this fact that they're going to try to give Joseph money for food, they want provisions, and Jacob is sending them with family money to buy that bread. But you know what's going to happen? Joseph is not going to let them purchase the provisions that he's going to give. You know the story, right? He's going to give the provisions. He's going to give the food to his brothers, to his family. But he's not going to take their money. Very important New Testament biblical truth there. And that is, you cannot buy the provisions and the blessings of God. You can't do it. I know it's a truth we come up against quite a bit in the scriptures, and you better believe every time I see it, I'm going to pull it out for us and I'm going to mention it. It's so important to know that with your own human goodness, and I might want to put that in quotations, with your own human goodness, you cannot merit the salvation of God. You cannot merit the blessings of God. If you were supposed to buy the salvation of God and the blessings of God based on your own goodness, your own good works, your own righteousness, well, I think you'd come to find out your credit score is pretty bad. I think you'd come to find out that you are spiritually bankrupt without Christ. That's what the scriptures teach. There's not a one of us in here that are here because the Lord saw us and just had to have us because we were such upstanding individuals in the community. Not a one of us. We were sinners. We were separated from Christ. We did nothing to deserve this. We did nothing to earn this, but He saved us. He put us into His family, and He gives us freely of the provision of God's grace and goodness. Now, if we could only get the banks to take that same approach. Who cares about your credit score? Do you want the loan? It's yours. Well, that's how it is spiritually with the Lord. He just wants you to come to Him. That's it. He wants you to come to Him. He wants you to believe in Him. He wants you to be a person that confesses your sins and repents and turns away from it and turns to Him. That's all that He wants. And it doesn't matter what your spiritual bank account said before you came to Christ. His answer is approved. You're accepted in the beloved, as the scripture says. Verse 3. So Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. Now that number is, of course, significant as well in our study. 10 brothers went to buy provision. And what do people do with the 10 commandments? What do they try to do with the 10 commandments? They try to buy their way to heaven. How many times have you heard people say, when you ask them, do you think you're a good person? Well, of course I'm a good person. I live by the 10 commandments. And, well, we know they don't. We know they violate the 10 commandments. We know there are some little white lies and half-truths every now and then. And, if you get through the big ones like murder, if you're not killing people, that's good. If you get through adultery, if you're not sleeping around and cheating on your spouse or someone else's spouse, great. If you get down through the big ones, that's great. But I'll tell you, there's one that's going to nail you, and that is, thou shalt not covet. That's probably got you because, you see something out there that you don't own, and you want it. And that little want in your heart is coveting. It's wanting something that's not yours. So people try to do this with the 10 commandments. If I just live by the 10 commandments, if I don't kill people, if I don't use the Lord's name in vain, which by the way, there's a big one right there. I don't think people realize how often they use the Lord's name in vain. I wish I had time to go there tonight, but I definitely don't. So we'll come back to that when we're studying the 10 commandments. But people think, hey, if I can live by these laws and do pretty good, be mostly on, not so much hit and miss, mostly hit, occasional misses, I should be all set for heaven. But God does not grade on that sliding and moving scale. He doesn't. God's standard for righteousness is absolute perfection, and it's impossible for us. So the 10 commandments cannot buy you into heaven, just as these 10 sons are not going to be able to buy provision from Joseph, the type of Christ in this story. Verse 4. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest some calamity befall him. Now, if you ask me, it sounds like Jacob does not trust these other 10 sons with Benjamin. Why, pray tell, might he feel that way? Because they didn't do so good with his other son from Rachel, Joseph. And you understand, that's what's happening here. These 10 sons that are being sent to Egypt, they're Jacob and Leah's kids. And you've read the story about Jacob. He doesn't seem like he's all too fond of those kids from Leah. He shows favorites, doesn't he? Who were his favorite kids? his sons from Rachel, his love, which was Joseph and Benjamin. Now, these 10 already blew it with Joseph. As far as Jacob knows, Joseph went out with the 10 sons and Joseph didn't come back. Remember? And they brought the bloody coat of many colors. And they said, "Is this your sons?" As if they didn't know. It was all just a big staged thing, an act. And he believes his son is dead. And that happened in his mind on the watch of his 10 sons with Leah. Now he's got one more kid from Rachel and he's lost Rachel. So this is the last remnant, he thinks, of his love, Rachel, his son, his youngest, Benjamin. And he thinks, no way am I trusting those 10 sons to Leah with my last son, Benjamin, from Rachel. So the 10 brothers here symbolize the nation of Israel in the type. The nation of Israel. These brothers to Leah are Joseph's half brothers. Now I know we'll be calling them his brothers as we go through this study. That's fine, that's accurate. But technically, they are Joseph's half brothers. He had the same father, but different mothers. And when you look at the Jewish nation, you come to find out the same thing. We call Jesus the brother of the Jews, and the Jews are kin to Jesus in the flesh. But what do we know, technically speaking? We know that really Jesus is only half brothers with the Jewish nation. His mother in the flesh, Mary, she was a Jew. But what about his father? Well, that's a different story altogether, isn't it? His father wasn't Joseph the Jew. His father was Father God. So Jesus technically being half brother to the Jews. So keep that in mind as we go through this. And I just want to once again point out that Jacob has not learned his lesson about playing favorites with his kids. This has caused him so much trouble already, and he still hasn't learned his lesson. He's still picking his favorites. I know my parents did it with me too, but I don't blame them. Sometimes it's called for. I only say that because my brother is not here. He's in Maryland. Verse 5. And the sons of Israel went to buy grain. They went to buy grain among those who journeyed, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. And we said last week, this was a type of the tribulation period. And the famine was what? In all lands. So it was in Egypt. It's all the way down in Canaan. It's everywhere. The famine is everywhere, just as the tribulation is going to affect all lands. Verse 6, now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. During those 7 years of plenty, Joseph had all of the land of Egypt storing away food supplies for the future hardship that was coming, these 7 years of famine. So now, in the 7 years of famine, Egypt is sitting on a bountiful supply. They had forward mention. They had forward revelation from the Lord that this was coming. By the way, it's a privilege, of people that walk closely with the Lord. You get that same privilege. Have you had that happen to you where you get a warning from the Lord? Something that doesn't sit right with you in your spirit before you even enter into a situation. So you go in a little hesitant because the Lord's put that warning in you. The Lord does that to those that follow him and actually have that kind of relationship where they're sensitive enough to the Spirit that they can hear the Lord communicating with them in those ways. And that's what the Lord has done for Egypt through this dream that Jacob has interpreted. They had the advance warning, so they were ready. None of the other nations had that. Interesting that all the other fake gods that were worshipped, all the demonic spirits that were energizing those false gods, not a one of them spoke up and warned their people. But Egypt knows because there's a man of God, Joseph, in Egypt. And anyone that wants to, because there is an abundant supply of provision of food in the land of Egypt. Anyone that wants to, they can come to Joseph and ask for resources. In the type, we see Joseph with nearly unlimited resources, sitting on an abundance there in Egypt. But the type is even stronger when we consider Jesus. He's not just sitting on an abundance of resources for you. He never runs out. There's never a shortage. There's never a lack. The Lord has absolutely unlimited spiritual resources. Philippians chapter 4, verse 19 says, "And my God shall supply all your need according to his riches in glory by Christ Jesus." There is no famine that hinders his resources for you. There's no hardship that you get yourself in by your own doing. The messes that you create for yourself, there's nothing that you can be in that would be such an intense time that would cause the resources of Christ for you to be depleted. He is sitting on an unlimited, heavenly, eternal wealth of provision for the church. Reading on. "And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth." Stop right there. This just got good. Do you remember when Joseph told his dreams to his brothers and his parents? "Brothers, in my dream, I had this dream. Pretty sure it was from the Lord. You guys bowed down to me." He told that same dream to his parents, the second one, about the sun and the moon bowing down. That represented Joseph's mother and father. And they were all outraged by that, weren't they? They were outraged by the fact that Joseph would have this dream, that they were bowing down before him. And pretty much the whole family said, "No way. There is no way that we're going to be bowing down to you, not anytime soon, not anytime ever." And his brothers immediately hatched a plan to do away with Joseph. That was their way of preventing that from ever happening. That's why first they thought about killing him, but then they decided to sell him off into slavery and make a little pocket change on the deal. The reason they did that was to prevent what Joseph predicted from his dream, to prevent that from happening. They did not want him to become the prominent one in the family. So they ditched him. They got rid of him. But get this. The very means that they took upon themselves to prevent this from happening have now turned around and become the very means by which it happens. See, they sell him so that they don't have to bow to him. They sell him so that he can't be the leader of the family and the gainer, the executor of the inheritance. But selling him into Egypt has brought them back full circle in this time of famine, and they have just bowed down before him. Only they don't know it's him yet. I think the same thing happened to Jesus. Don't you think? The religious people there in the city of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, they did not like the ministry of Jesus. It did not fit the religious molds that they had placed all of the Old Testament scriptures into and squeezed the life out of by the letter of the law. And so enraged they became with Jesus, so filled with envy over the ministry, the authority, the power, the results of Jesus. So enraged they became about that they decided, we've got to do something. His words, his teaching, his works all point to this, that he's Messiah, he's Lord. But we're not going to bow the knee. So what do they start to do? They start to plot very early on in the ministry of Jesus how they might kill him. And you can read that in the parable, right? The parable of the kingdom where the Father sends the Son in the allegory. The Father sends the Son thinking that they'll respect and reverence the Son. But what do they do with the Son? They say, let's kill him, and then the whole thing's ours. We get the inheritance. We get the field. We get the kingdom. And so, once again, the very means that those religious leaders in Jerusalem took to prevent that possibility of ever happening, to prevent the possibility of ever having to bow the knee to Jesus, the very means that they took become the very means by which one day they will bow. Because they did put him to death. Only he didn't stay there. He was put in the tomb and 3 days later resurrected. And that right there, by merit of the resurrection, that will be the means by which they are judged. Amazing, incredible connection there. So here they are bowing exactly as they said they would not. They're bowing. Verse 7. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them because his brothers didn't recognize him. He recognized them. I mean, it makes sense. He's probably bald with no beard. He's looking like an Egyptian. He's shaven, and he's probably got one of those big old Egyptian hats that kind of make you look like a king cobra. You know what I'm talking about? Wraps all around the side. He would look very different. He's in disguise. He's a ruler there. And Joseph is going to take advantage of that. He's going to have a little fun with that. This is going to be his paybacks, but it's probably not what you're thinking. He's going to have some fun with this. He's going to run with this. He's going to play this out, but it's not the way that maybe most of us would do it. And I'll show you what I mean as we go through this. He begins with this. Pardon me. He spoke roughly to them. He spoke roughly to his half-brothers. And Jesus spoke roughly to the religious leaders, didn't he? To the religious people. Same thing. Why do you suppose that is? Why do you suppose that Joseph would speak roughly to his brothers? Why do you suppose that Jesus would speak roughly to his flesh and blood that weren't believers, that were religious? Why would that take place? Because they're angry? No. Are they mad? Are they trying to prove their point? Why would they take that posture with their own brothers? Well, it was more than that. Obviously, it was for the purpose of conviction. Joseph and Jesus both knew that restoration, full restoration, only happens when there is full repentance. You can't have full restoration if there's not full repentance. So restoration is only going to happen when a person really gets a deep down, good, solid understanding of where they have erred. And as it pertains to each one of us, Anchored, this is what the law of God does for us. The law of God speaks roughly to us. The law is not comforting. It doesn't care if you're comfortable. You read through the law of Moses. It's not there to save you. It's there to pinpoint your wrongs. And that's what the law is supposed to do. The scriptures tell us that. The law is supposed to beat you up and give you a real clear vision of the kind of person you really are. It's supposed to show you, man, I'm trying so hard. Why do I keep failing? Why do I keep contradicting the scriptures with my lifestyle? Why can't I get this stuff down even though I know what the scriptures say? Well, that's what the law is supposed to do. As you know, the Apostle Paul tells us that the law is meant to be a schoolmaster, a tutor to bring you to Christ. So imagine this. Here's what the law is. It's that nun cracking you over the hand with a ruler over and over and over again until you get frustrated and go to grace. That's what the law is for, right? The law is to beat you up, to point out your errors, and to make you real sure that you are not getting to heaven without God's grace and a perfect Savior. That's the law's purpose. So the law speaks roughly to us. Joseph spoke roughly to his brothers because conviction needs to happen. Jesus spoke roughly to some of those unbelieving Jews, not because he was against them, but because he wanted their hearts to be convicted, which means convinced of their wrong, and find him. Reading on, then he said to them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan," the promised land, Israel, "to buy food." Verse 8, so Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And we pointed this out already. His brothers did not recognize Joseph the first time. So the type holds true because the brothers of Jesus, the Jews, by and large, did not recognize him or receive him the first time that he came, in his first appearance, his first coming. This is actually a usual pattern for the nation of Israel. And you can read this for yourself. Stephen points this out in Acts chapter 7. He goes down through the history of the nation of Israel, and he points out that this is a tendency of the nation. He begins there with Moses. Moses shows up there in Egypt while the nation is under Egyptian bondage, and he shows up in the form of a deliverer, and the nation rejected Moses. You remember what happened? He sees an Egyptian taskmaster quarreling with an Israelite, and Moses steps in and kills the Egyptian taskmaster, probably an overreaction, but he did it nonetheless. And according to Stephen's words, he tells us right there in verse 25 of Acts 7, he says that Moses supposed that his brothers would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. In other words, and you don't really see this from the Old Testament, you don't find it out until the New Testament, but when Moses did that and stepped up in vengeance against the enemies of Israel, what he was doing was already sensing and feeling that call to be a deliverer for the nation of Israel and lead them out of bondage. But at Moses' first appearance as a deliverer, the nation rejected him. So off he goes into Midian for 40 years. He comes back later as an 80-year-old man, and the nation accepts him the second time as a deliverer, and he leads the nation out. Then you come to the promised land, and Moses shows up with the nation there at the promised land for the first time. There's the promised land. There's what God wants to do. There's their blessing right ahead of them. And Moses sends in 12 spies. How many of them came back with a bad report? 10. How many had a good report? 2. You're going to see those numbers constantly in scriptures. All sorts of things connecting, just like wires to a machine. And so what happened? The nation, because the majority of the spies came back and said, we can't do it. We can't go in. It's not our time. There's giants over there. We look like grasshoppers to them. We look like grasshoppers to us. No way we can take that land. And so they don't go in the first time. 40 years in the desert, wandering around, twiddling their thumbs. They come back again under the leadership of Joshua, the successor of Moses. And the second time they were able to go into the promised land. On and on, this sort of thing continues throughout the history of the nation. David was rejected at his first appearance when he stood up, the only one that would stand up to Goliath. David shows up as a deliverer for the nation, and what do his brothers say? David, you're a puny runt. Goliath down, why us men take care of this problem. This is a man sort of problem, not a little shepherd boy sort of problem. We're going to take care of it the right way. We're going to hide out over here, shiver and shake in fear. But the second time David appears as a deliverer, he's received. On and on it goes. It is a prophetic certainty, folks. It's a prophetic certainty that when Jesus comes back the second time in his second coming, the Jews will receive him as Messiah and deliverer. So don't you get down on the Jews, and don't you ever think I am. No, absolutely not. Don't you get down on the Jews and say, they always blow it the first time, them Jews. No, that's not what you need to be saying. You need to be saying they may miss it the first time, but they get it right the second time. Those Jews get it right the second time. How many times does it take you to get stuff right? More than that, I'd bet. How many times have you been out there witnessing to unbelieving Americans, and how many times have they rejected the gospel? Probably more than 2. Right, so credit where credit is due. The Jews will find Messiah at his second coming. Verse 9. Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them and said to them, I told you so. I was right and you were wrong. You bowed down just like I said you would. Well, that's what many would have said in a similar situation. But not Joseph. Not Joseph. Even better than telling someone that you were right is letting them find it out for themselves. It's just much better. You know, there's that verse in Proverbs that says, let another man's mouth praise you and not yourself, another person's lips and not your own. Don't sing your praises. I was right. I am so smart. I'm always right. I thought I was wrong that one time, but it turns out I was right. No. So much better just to be a big person in your spirit. When you're right and someone else is wrong, just let it pass. Let that lob pass without taking the swing. And if they're going to come to you and say, hey, I see it now. You were right and I was wrong. Then you still need to be humble. Hopefully you don't even need that. Hopefully you're not waiting on that. I'm just waiting for so-and-so over there to come over and admit it, that I was right. No, let's not need that. Let's just be big people like Joseph. He goes on to say, he's just having fun. He's letting it go here. He says, you are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land. You've come to pick out our military weaknesses. This is a military reconnaissance mission. You're wanting to overthrow the nation. That's what you're doing. You're looking for weak spots to attack. Verse 10, and they said to him, no, my Lord. Oh man, they're bowing. Now they're even calling him Lord. No, my Lord, but your servants have come to buy food. Verse 11, we are all one man's sons. We are honest men. Oh, really? Do tell. Do tell us how honest you are. Remember who they're talking to. There's Jacob in the pit, there's Joseph in the pit. He's listening to his brothers talk, and some of his brothers are saying, let's murder him. And Reuben talks him out of it and says, let's go get a sandwich. No, wait. Reuben talks him out of it and says, no, let's not murder him. Let's not kill him. Let's do this. Let's sell him off. Let's sell him off into slavery. And we'll tell Dad something different. Joseph was hearing all that. I'm pretty sure he was hearing all that. If he wasn't hearing it, let me tell you, he does know what happened. Because when we get to the end of it, he's going to understand the evil intentions his brothers had for him. So he's on to something. He knows about some of this. He knows they're not honest men. He knows they lied about him. And the problem that he's in is because of their lies. So, yeah, think about who you're talking to when you say stuff like that. Their assessment of themselves is, hey, we're good guys. We tell the truth when we're not lying. We do. We're pretty good men. And, well, Joseph knows better. So reading on, your servants are not spies. Well, they did get that part right. That's true. They're not spies. Verse 12, but he said to them, no, but you have come to see the nakedness of the land. And they said, your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And in fact, the youngest is with our father today. That would be Benjamin. And they say, Well, one is no more. That would be, of course, Joseph that they're speaking about. And I like how they're careful with their words there. They don't say one of our brothers died, because they know he's not dead. They know he's just not home, so they have to say, well, one of our brothers, yeah, he's not around anymore. And they're skirting the issue. Verse 14, but Joseph said to them, it is as I spoke to you, saying, you are spies. In this manner you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send out one of you, and let him bring your brother, and you shall be kept in prison, that your words may be tested to see whether there is any truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh surely you are spies. Why is Joseph doing this? This is not your typical Egyptian lie detector test. Really, this proves nothing. If he sends the brothers out, or in this case, if he keeps them all but one person, sends that one brother back to come back with their brother that they say is at home, that's not proving anything. I mean, you could very easily stop along the way, find some guy along the road and say, hey, you want to make $20? For toilet paper purposes, whatever you need to buy. You want to make $20? I got a quick way you can make $20. Pretend to be our brother. That way we don't get killed by the Egyptians. Okay, sure, no problem. So that really proves nothing. That's not why he's doing this. He's doing this because Joseph doesn't even know if his little brother is still alive. For all Joseph knows, Benjamin may be lying face down on the ground in a pit somewhere, and his brothers are lying to his face about what happened to Benjamin. For all he knows, Benjamin has met the same kind of fate that he met because of those 10 brothers from Leah. So he wants to find out, is my brother okay? Is my brother alive? He wants to secure that before he starts handing out provision. And I think he knows they're going to learn a whole lot of stuff along the way as this story unfolds. So, verse 17, he put them all together in prison 3 days. Then Joseph said to them the third day, do this and live, for I fear God. Interesting. Now, the Hebrew that is used to write this story uses the word Elohim here for God. Elohim. Yes, it's a plural. Good pick up there. But we know that word is the title for Yahweh, the title for God as creator and ruler. That's a Hebrew word. That's a Jewish thing. He, at this point, is a Jewish God. And Joseph, whether he dropped this name like this or not, I think either way should have tipped them off that something is fishy here. Because Joseph is not talking about fearing Osiris or Iris or Ra, the sun god, the Egyptian gods. He is referencing their God. He's saying, I fear your God, Elohim. And that should have their little minds churning right now. But instead they don't get it. And do you realize they did the same thing with Jesus? Jesus came in the name of the Father. And yet no one believed him. No one received him. They did not believe it. He was not identified. He was not embraced. Just another tie-in between the life of Joseph, the story of Joseph, the life of Jesus, the story of Jesus. Verse 19, if you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined to your prison house, but you go and carry grain for the famine of your houses. So Joseph has changed his mind. His original plan was, I'll keep all of the brothers in prison. I'll send one of them away. And after 3 days of letting them stew over this and stress about this, finally he changes his mind. He says, no, you know what? I'm just going to keep the one of you. I'm going to send the rest of you to go get your brother. You bring your brother back. I'll know at least you're telling me some of the truth, and maybe I can start to trust you more. Verse 20, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified and you shall not die. And they did so. Then they said to one another, we are truly guilty concerning our brother. For we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered them, saying, did I not speak to you, saying, do not sin against this boy, and you would not listen? I told you so. Joseph's not the guy to say, I told you so, but Reuben is. I told you guys. I told you this was going to be a disaster. Therefore, behold, his blood is now required of us. You can flip to Matthew 27:25 in your home time, not right now. But the scriptures there have the unbelieving religious leaders leading a riot there at the trial of Jesus, getting the crowd to chant out concerning Jesus, crucify him. Let his blood be upon us and upon our kids. We'll take full responsibility. And Reuben is saying, we are fully responsible for what we did to our brother. His blood is required of us. Verse 23, but they did not know that Joseph understood them, for he spoke to them through an interpreter. I love this story because we just found out that the whole time that Joseph is speaking back and forth with his brothers, he's still in the ruse. He's still playing the game. He's still stretching this out and squeezing all the juice he can out of this situation. He's talking in Egyptian, and he's speaking through an interpreter that is then communicating back and forth between him and his brothers. He's not speaking in the Jewish language. He's not speaking Hebrew. So now his brothers are standing there huddled and mumbling to one another, and Joseph's right there. They're in his presence talking about the situation. They don't realize that he can understand what they're saying. I love that. It reminds me of a story from when I was, I think, around 12 years old. I went to youth camp. I fell in love. Sorry, Maggie. I fell in love with one of the counselors there, female counselor. She was probably about 30, and I was 12. That's the only reason I'm telling this story. And when I got home, I was so taken by her. And I sent her, I took and wrote up a nice long letter to her. Because for some of you younger ones, that's how we used to have to do it back in the 80s and 90s. That was our emails and our texts. You send a letter, they get it in 3 days. Wait another 3 days, you might get a response back. So I sent that nice letter off, and at the very bottom I wrote, P.S. Yo amor tú, because I had this little Spanish dictionary and I was looking up words. So I looked up I love you in the Spanish dictionary, and I wrote that at the bottom, P.S. Yo amor tú. And I sent that off, thinking I was so smart, very confident that she wouldn't know what it was saying. And the letter come back 6 days later or so. I got my text back. And it was a nice letter. She responded to everything. Good conversation. I was loving it. And then I got to the bottom and she wrote, P.S. I took Spanish in college. And man, my face went beet red. And I decided right then and there, I will never talk to her again. I've embarrassed myself good. Well, he was understanding everything they were saying. He was understanding the language that they spoke. And they're talking about what they did to him. And he hears the remorse and the regret in their hearts. Verse 24. And he turned himself away from them and wept. Because all of those years of wondering, how could they do this to me? How could they put me through this and feel nothing? How could they not even care? Do they have no remorse whatsoever? Now he sees their broken hearts. Now he sees their remorse. Now he sees that they're consumed with it. Slightest thing happens, and they just figure it's got to be because of what we did to Joseph, I stubbed my toe on the coffee stand. Had to be because of what we did to Joseph. I just know it. That's why many people who commit murder and things like that get caught. because they spend their whole life running from something, feeling like it's tracking them down, sensing it around every corner, getting ready to pop out and catch them. That remorse and that guilt follows them all of their life, and then they get careless and reckless and caught. And that's where his brothers are, man. Everything that happens, they just feel that remorse and that guilt of what they've done to Joseph. And there's Joseph weeping for them. What do we read of Jesus in Luke 19:41? That as he drew near the city of Jerusalem, Jesus saw the city and wept over it. Matthew chapter 23, verse 37, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I wanted to gather you together, your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." Reading on. Then he returned to them again and talked with them, and he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. He's going all out. He's trying to make this as realistic and frightening as possible because conviction is happening and he knows it. Verse 25, "Then Joseph gave a command to fill their sacks with grain, to restore every man's money to his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. Thus he did for them." This is the paybacks that we're talking about in Genesis 42. Joseph finally gets his chance at paybacks. And that's what he does. He pays them back their money. He takes the money that they brought to buy food, and he puts the money back in their knapsacks. And he puts food in there too. He sends them on their journey with provisions for their journey. And they didn't have to buy it. And that's the Lord for you. You didn't come worthy to buy from him. You keep your money, but you get his blessings anyway. The Lord is so good to us. Man, you're just seeing the character of Joseph over and over and over again. He is paying back evil with good. Now, doesn't that sound like a Christian thing to do? Doesn't that sound like a New Testament thing to do? Pay back evil with good. Love those that hate you. Be kind to those that hate you. Pray for those that despitefully use you. Paul says in Romans chapter 12, verse 20, "Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink, for in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head." I love to teach that verse because most Christians get it wrong. They think that means if I feed my enemy when he's hungry or give him drink when he's thirsty, if I do kind things for my enemy, that'll really get him good. That'll really make him mad. That'll get his anger gone. It'll be like fires burning on his head. That's not what the scripture's saying. It's not paying back your enemy with kindness as like an ultimate form of vengeance, as some of the commentaries will say. Wrong. That's not what this was. This was if you were in a home with your friend was visiting you away from your home. Now 5-6 hours later, it's time for him to go home, only it's in the cold of winter. And he's got to go home to a cold house. And he's got to get firewood and fire starter and start a fire. And it's going to take a little while before he's got hot coals in the fire in his home to warm up the home and keep him comfortable. And that's you taking the live fire coals from your fire, putting them in a clay pot, sticking them on your friend's head, because that's how they used to carry things. You know, they used to take either the baskets or the clay pots and walk around with them on their head. That's you sending your friend off with live coals from your fire so that when they get to their house, they throw those in and they're instantly warm. That's you speeding up the warming process of your friend. Paul said, do that to your enemies too. By the way, he was quoting from the Proverbs. You do that to your enemies too. You send your enemies away with something that's going to warm their hearts and bless their lives. That's what you do for your enemies. Man, I wish we could go further into this. It is, let's make a mad dash here. Verse 26, "So they loaded their donkeys with the grain and departed from there. But as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey feed at the encampment, he saw his money." Wasn't supposed to be in his knapsack, but it's there. There it was in the mouth of his sack. So he said to his brothers, my money has been restored, and there it is in my sack. Then their hearts failed them, and they were afraid, saying to one another, what is this that God has done to us? I bet it's about Joseph. Oh man, this is bad. It's going to look like we robbed Egypt. We're going to die. When we go back, if we don't go back, either way, we're going to die. Verse 29, then they went to Jacob, their father, in the land of Canaan, and told him all that had happened to them, saying, the man who is Lord of the land spoke roughly to us. He hurt our feelings and took us for spies of the country. But we said to him, we are honest men. We are not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no more, and the youngest is with our father this day in the land of Canaan. Then the man, the Lord of the country, said to us, by this I will know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me. Take food for the famine of your households and be gone, and bring your youngest brother to me. So I shall know that you are not spies, but that you are honest men. I will grant your brother to you, and you may trade in the land. Then it happened as they emptied their sacks. So now the rest of them check out their sacks. And it says, surprisingly, each man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw the bundles of money, they were afraid. And Jacob, their father, said to them, you have bereaved me. Joseph is no more. Just a quick point. Same terminology that Jacob uses concerning what he believes to be the death of his son. And I think that's because he didn't have that closure. He didn't really know for sure. He didn't really know for sure if his son had passed or what had happened. And so he says the same thing. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more. That's the one that's back in prison in Egypt. Jacob says, oh, well, I'm never going to see him again either. And, reading on, you want to take Benjamin? All these things are against me. Let's read the rest of this, then we're going to come back to that statement. All these things are against me. Verse 37, then Reuben spoke to his father, saying, kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands, and I will bring him back to you. That's him saying, look, I'm so serious about this. I'm taking my own kids' lives on the safety of Benjamin. I personally guarantee you that I'm going to protect him. And you got to admit, Reuben's looking like a pretty good guy, isn't he? I mean, of all these 10 sons, I think Reuben is a pretty solid guy. So he's willing to protect Benjamin. Verse 38, but Jacob said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is left alone. If any calamity should befall him along the way in which you go, then you would bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. Back to this statement. All things are against me. That's what Jacob thinks. That's what Jacob feels. All things are against me. I know we know this verse so well, but this is just such a perfect snapshot of what happens to us too. We know the verse, don't we? Romans chapter 8, verse 28. You could quote it with me. It says this, and we know all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. So that's what we know biblically, intellectually, scripturally, conceptually. That's what we know. And then when things start looking like they're not working out for our good, what do? We start to believe what we see. That's what Jacob was doing. He was believing what he was seeing instead of what God had promised. And we do the same thing. We look around, we start seeing what looks like total collapse in our life. We start looking at all of the things that appear to be working against us, all of the disastrous things that make us uncomfortable in life. And even though we know scripturally, biblically, conceptually, even though we know that the scriptures have promised us that for those who love the Lord and have been called by him, that all things that are happening in your life are working for your good, even though we know that by concept, we don't believe it in everyday life. We believe with our eyes instead of with our heart of faith. It's a huge problem. If you're believing, see, That's what really separates the person of faith from anyone else out there. The person of faith has a different approach on life. The person of faith believes God over anything they see or hear in life and in the world. That's what sets you apart from the world. Scriptures say without faith, it is impossible to please God. So if you're going to be just like the world, and if you're only going to believe the Scriptures when things are smooth sailing, you're not the way the church is supposed to be. You're not the way the believer is supposed to be. You're supposed to believe that way regardless of what's happening. Don't believe what you see. Faith is not blind. Faith is not blind. Faith sees further and deeper than your eyes can. Here's what Jacob is going to find out. If he could have just waited a chapter, one more chapter, if he could have just waited one more chapter, he'd see that all of these things that he thinks are working against him are working for him. Right now, he thinks he's lost 2 sons. He thinks he's on the verge of losing the third one if he sends the third one. But what's going to happen? All of these things that he thinks are working against him are going to bring him back together with all of his sons. And wonderful blessings are coming if he would have just stayed patient and waited. I hope you're the kind of person that'll do that. I hope you're the kind of person that, like the meme, the house is on fire and you're sitting there with your leg folded and just... I hope you're the kind of person that can go through a collapse of life, disaster all around you, and not be moved in your faith. If you're like that, you're to be commended, because not many are. Let's stand. We'll close with that.